and she did a fantastic job. So I'm going to give just a special shout out to her. Thank you for managing that really big and important process. If you have questions, I told people yesterday, you know, please come up and talk to me, introduce yourself. If you have good things to say about the conference, please share them with me. If you have problems or issues about the conference, please talk to my co-chair, Dan Montgomery. And with that lovely introduction, Dan, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and co-chair, Dan Montgomery.
I like you too, Lynn.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, well, I want to say a little bit more about how we arrived at the theme for this conference, given the fact that it was happening in Denver. And we wanted an opportunity to kind of move the dialogue forward in terms of the kinds of topics we have year to year, but also really showcase what's going on here. Because Colorado's really a pretty special place. You know, it was pretty much a wild prairie, you know, 150 years ago, and now you can see what the traffic is like here, which apparently is a sign of progress. But one of the things that really I think has made Colorado very successful in the new economy in particular, based on an older heritage of agriculture and mining, is the way that we've moved into technical and engineering types of innovation, and we wanted to focus how that works. And our first speaker is the best person I could imagine to introduce us to that. What we've seen in Colorado is a huge amount of growth that's a combination of government laboratories and research, some really strong universities, the advantages of our climate, corporate and private investment, great educational institutions, and a real attitude of collaboration that really goes back to Colorado's founding. So this kind of innovation ecosystem is really what's brought a tremendous amount of growth and wealth to this state. So just as a couple of examples, I know Dan Powers is going to tell us a little bit more, but I've lived in Boulder for a long time, about 30 miles that way, and a lot of people trace what happened in Boulder. It was a university town going back to the 1890s, but in the Eisenhower era, there were a number of government labs that landed in Boulder, so that brought in a lot of scientists. This made it attractive for IBM to open a plant in the mid-60s, which spun off all kinds of people, because if you may remember the old slogan with IBM, it stood for I've been moved. But they would move people here and they would refuse to move away. So they would say, let's start a company. So one company after another was calved off of IBM, and today we have a huge tech innovation ecosystem, including Techstars. We'll be hearing from Hannah Davis with Techstars tomorrow afternoon. That's all happened at the same time because we also have a large military presence and a lot of room for an airport out there. If you flew in, you might have noticed. We have a huge aerospace area, which also calls on a lot of collaboration between engineering, government spending, military strategy, all kinds of things like that. We're big in medical devices. And even Boulder in particular is called the Silicon Valley of natural foods. It's where a lot of new products develop and then end up getting merged into bigger companies or going public. So we have a lot of different domains where there's a tremendous amount of innovation. So it's a very young, vibrant city. We're getting thousands of people move here every month. There's a lot happening. So there's really nobody better than Dan Powers to describe how this whole innovation ecosystem works. Dan, when I first met Dan, 12, 13 years ago, I think he was working for the Boulder Chamber of Commerce. He's now the executive director of CoLabs, and he'll describe what CoLabs does, I'm sure. But he's a guy whose mission is, he calls it the informed evolution of society. So he's a natural connector. He's a guy that knows everybody, it would seem, and has a very holistic perspective on what's happening here. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dan. Take it away. Let's have a big hand for Dan. Thanks very much. Okay, you're wired, so you don't want that. All right.
Clicker. All right, good morning. You know, about 3 months ago, I got a call from Dan Montgomery, and as he says, we've known each other for over 10 years, but haven't spoken to each other frequently for probably the last 5. So it was a great, hey, what's going on? I see you're working in collabs. Could you tell me a little bit more? And he described some of his project, and I've known from prior coffee chats about his work in strategic planning and the types of clients that he works with. But for me, I gave him an update on the last 3 years that I've been part of Collabs, which is a 12-year-old consortium of federally funded research labs and institutes that was started in 2007 now by then Governor Bill Ritter through a grant from the Office of Economic Development and International Trade here in Colorado, and a set of players from economic development, excuse me, and excuse me, research lab realms that I'll get into those details. As Dan had done his homework and checked out my LinkedIn profile and some other projects I'd been involved in, I think he already knew what he had in mind at the beginning of the conversation, but it led to an invitation for me to come here today. And as he gave me some more context, I thought this sounds like a great group, and I'm always happy to describe Colorado's research ecosystem. So I'm here today, and many of you may have had this experience about 2 hours after hanging up the phone call. There's that thought of, what did I just say yes to? I need to obviously do some strategic planning about what I'm going to talk about at this gathering. So I went out and did a little research, actually a lot of research. When I Googled strategic planning, it said there's about 533 million results. And these are just the top 20 books that I noticed, and looked through some of those. A couple of them I did already own myself, but this realm of strategy and strategic planning covers different industries. There's certainly different mindsets or different schools of thought around the types of strategic planning that go on, and I wanted to try to get as much of a broad sense of what your backgrounds and interests might be before coming here. And it occurs to me that there is strategic planning everywhere. It's in government and private sector. It's happening informally in your own houses. It's going on when you get up in the morning and try to decide where you're going to go for your meetings, etc. So I have now this broad impression of how what you do is both ubiquitous and crucial. And that is a common thread I would like to share with, or that I perceive with, the research lab ecosystem that we have here in Colorado. So, let me bump this here. If you think back to this morning, within the first 30 minutes or hour after you woke up, you likely got something to drink, you started to get dressed, you had some food, and you probably checked your phone. For some folks, you might have checked your phone within the first 5 minutes. All of those very common, very automatic type of behaviors or items that you use have deep taproots back into the federal research lab ecosystem, and you as a taxpayer have been funding the creation of these different items, these different textiles, these different foods, these different paradigms of societal norms and societal resources that you get to use every day. I think it's often overlooked that taxpayers have been the source, and very dedicated scientists have been the source of things that we use every day and very often take for granted. If I jump to a smartphone, the touch screen, GPS system, the voice-over commands that you can use, most of those, well, those 3 in particular that I've listed, all have backgrounds in US military research that got started for more of national security and keeping up with what other countries and other players in the global ecosystem of military conflicts were doing. You might not know, though, that GPS is something that got started back in the 60s with this woman, Gladys West. She was a mathematician for the US Navy, and some of her studies some of her research is really at the foundation of how GPS works today. So when you get up and use your phone, know that the US military excuse me, was interested in making sure they knew where the Russians were putting satellites up in the sky, and they wanted to also make sure that our submarines weren't crashing into undersea mountains. And that's why we get to pull out a phone now and figure out where McDonald's is right away. That technology may have actually stayed a bit more in-house, a bit more as a trade secret, as it were, to the United States military. But if you recall, in 1989, shortly after the first GPS satellite went up, I'm sure you were reading news about it at that time, but there was a Korean airliner that was shot down over Russia for apparently going over the international boundary or their border. And President Reagan decided somewhat within just a couple days that the technology to track where people are using GPS would become a free public good and could be used by anyone who wanted to implement it. So nowadays that's continued to get refined closer and closer, or excuse me, more and more precise, and that's where GPS came from. Also this morning, if you just had some water, let alone juice or any other kind of liquid, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Environmental Protection Agency have scientists who have been tasked since back in the 50s, and actually the creation of the EPA goes to 1970 and the Clean Water Act in 1972. There are scientists today who continually are taking in water samples, setting up the kinds of protocols, the kind of standards that must be met for every municipal water system and every municipal water utility in the country. Those scientists stay busy behind the scenes tracking a whole range of somewhat nasty toxins or other types of biological entities that may be in our water, and you should be receiving, it's a federal law that by July 1st every year you will get a report from your local water provider, whether it's a municipal entity or another type of government structured authority, describing what is in your water and how that relates to what federal standards there are. If you haven't seen one of those, know it should be coming. But in any case, you're able to drink water without really thinking, oh, is this going to melt my tongue? Is this simply going to taste really bad? Now, depending on where you are in the country, I know there may be differences as to the flavor that you might actually get. A lot of people go with bottled water for that reason. But the minimum standards of safety and reduced toxicity, or at least no toxicity, is where we're aiming for. This is all happening behind the scenes and goes back to what your taxes help to fund in terms of chemists and water scientists and other types of researchers who work for those two particular agencies I mentioned. Also, you're all wearing clothes, I noticed, so many of you may be wearing permanent press or wrinkle-free cotton clothes, and the sheets that you slept on may have felt particularly smooth and comfortable. The research around permanent press got started by a chemist with the US Department of Agriculture back in the 50s. This woman here on the left, excuse me, is Ruth Benito, and she discovered a way to actually help to bind the fibers that are within the cotton plant in a manner that creates enough of a tightness that we actually don't get wrinkles. From there, her science and her team, throughout her decades of working for the USDA, found ways to then make more flame retardant couches, children's clothing, materials for first responders, firefighters, and policemen. And that goes back to trying to figure out a way to help the cotton industry. She's credited with saving the cotton industry because post-World War II, the rise of other synthetic fibers was creating a whole new realm of nylon, polyester, clothes that did not need to be ironed. And if you think back into the 50s with the rise of ovens and washing machines and all sorts of other tools that were giving the young families growing at the time all sorts of technology to make their life easier, having clothes that you didn't have to iron was quite a compelling value proposition by those new types of clothes. So having cotton that would also not have to be necessarily ironed as often was something that took off and in essence saved the cotton industry from being totally eclipsed by those synthetic fibers. Now in Colorado, with that as a baseline, I'm going to prompt you more on some technologies that you're using all the time, you're paying for every year with your taxes, and that they make our country really one of the leading innovators and setting the stage for the evolution of society, because we've taken it into our hands and have had as a mindset, in essence, since before, with research into World War II and a military realm, and then after World War II, the self-presumption of brilliance, of national pride and national security that is driving research into federal research labs, into all sorts of technologies. That is what has helped shape where we are today, and I'm going to flesh that out a little bit more and also tie that back into how I see the strategic planning that many of your organizations do are very much in a similar range of skills. There's more of a connection than I actually perceived before doing my homework with what all of your type of businesses are and how the federal research scientists are doing what they're doing. There's also a bit of threat to this ecosystem, but I'll touch on that in a little while. So you can see here these federal research labs that Dan made a mention to. They got started back in the 50s in Boulder, around the research university, University of Colorado. But here in the state, in addition to these federally funded research labs, we also have the research universities and then numerous economic development organizations, all with an interest in promoting and prompting the growth of a range of industries. We have bioscience, we have aerospace, we have agriculture and ag tech, clean energy and renewable energy technology. And then there's a whole range of aerospace and low Earth atmosphere, as well as solar system exploration research that's happening. There's biomedical across a gigantic range, from disease prevention to wellness technologies and all sorts of medical technology equipment. Colorado actually has the second highest concentration of federal research labs in the country outside of Washington, D.C. That's not exactly an intentional federal level decision. There wasn't strategic planning around that, I guess I could say. But it's more of a holistic, those who are in the know, seeing where other brilliant people are, deciding to come and locate around them. In this ecosystem here, then, if you add the researchers and economic development organizations to, from our perspective in collabs, the other important players are elected officials and civic leaders, and also the media. Collabs sits right in the middle of all of those, and our job is to champion the economic and intellectual impact of all these federal research labs in Colorado to Congress, so that they understand the value of taxpayer-funded research, and they continue to keep those labs funded and keep them here. Now, all these labs are national assets, so while we want them to be here, their story and their impact is actually national at least, and in many cases global. So what we want to do is be sure that sometimes skeptical or ignorant, and I mean that in just simply a have not heard of it before way, folks who are in leadership positions understand why these labs are worth keeping here and how they are helping the country. This is just a quick sample of some of them, and the acronyms may make sense to you or may resonate with you, but that scope of technology that I was describing before exists here, particularly between Fort Collins, Colorado, and Colorado Springs. It's about a 90-mile corridor where there are nearly 8,000 employees, another 10,000 connected employees with all the different services that are provided to these labs. And we also have, from our economic impact studies we do every couple years, we know that there's a nearly $3 billion impact on the state of Colorado's economy. Hence, it's a puzzle piece that state economic developers and other types of economic planners recognize they would like to keep. We do have nearly half of Colorado's 64 counties with employees, but the concentration of those employees is particularly along the Front Range of Colorado, as I was describing. However, for those who might be from Colorado, we always like to emphasize how there's people who live in various counties with the rise of different types of either virtual working, virtual connections with teams, or there's field offices and field research stations of different types throughout the other parts of the state. This isn't just a Boulder gem, or this isn't just a resource for the Denver Federal Center. This really is a broader Colorado type of puzzle piece that we want to keep. Now, why there's so many, Dan alluded to some of the history here. Back in the 50s, President Eisenhower was particularly interested in Colorado. He would come out here to fish and to vacation. And the mindset after World War II was particularly sensitive to anything of interest to our perceived enemies being on the coasts, whether that was simply to be observed by those enemies or to be spied upon or bombed or otherwise somehow manipulated. So the center of the country really became an interesting spot and a very pragmatic location for federal assets that would be doing, at that time, particularly military type of research. However, or I should visit here that reference to Boulder donating land, and similar types of actions ended up happening in Fort Collins with the United States Department of Agriculture during the 50s and 60s. But as this network has grown, starting back in the 50s, there might have been that serendipitous connection between practical location within the center of the country and a president who happened to visit and really enjoy Colorado, and then him meeting friends who had connections to the University of Colorado, and the University of Colorado describing, here's the research we're already doing. Some of that research that was going on in the early 50s was at LASP, the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics. This organization predates NASA. And LASP was created after World War II when the United States government had some V-2 rockets from the Germans and were trying to figure out how to fly them in New Mexico. And they weren't having much success, and they started to look out in a concentric circle from where they were to see where the next best location of physicists who might be able to help them were, and the first research university they came upon was the University of Colorado at Boulder. So they came up with some of the rockets and some of the military folks and found the physicists at the University of Colorado and said, we have these and you're going to help us figure out how to fly them. And those scientists were intrigued by what they saw as some new technology, and they started reverse engineering and otherwise figuring out how to send these rockets up. And their interest was to go up as high as possible, and they kept iterating and going higher and higher, and eventually in the late 50s, the first rocket that went up outside of our atmosphere came from research at the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics. Now, even though there was a military background to all of this, the physicists at University of Colorado were not as interested in the military side, and they said, next time that goes up, we need to put a camera in there and take a picture. And so the first picture of space from outside of our atmosphere, without what is in essence the filter or the cloudiness that we get from our own atmosphere, came from a rocket that went up outside of LASP. The military kept saying, that's good, just keep going. That's great. You guys keep figuring out how to fly it higher and farther. That's just what we're hoping for. And eventually that split off, and that technology has gone back in with the Air Force and Department of Defense. But the Laboratory for Atmospheric and Space Physics is now the only entity in the world that has built rockets that have flown to all 8 planets and Pluto and the sun. The students who are there design these satellites, they build them there, then they hand them off to whatever the launching agency may be, and once they're in the sky, there's a mission control there, and the students are learning how to control satellites from this mission control center up at CU Boulder, and then the best and the brightest are taken from that group and often hired out, if they choose not to stay in academia, hired out into the private sector. That's one of the threads between federal research, so National Science Foundation grants, NASA, National Aerospace and Aeronautics grants come to CU, and that's coming from you first, taxpayers. Goes through grants to CU University, Colorado University. Students learn at the top of the profession there, and then go out and help create companies, or otherwise become chief scientists and other types of crucial workers within these private sector companies. The satellites that we are all counting on now to give us GPS, to give us our immediate internet connection, to give us smooth Zoom meetings with people halfway around the world, those are coming from and are managed by students who ultimately have been funded through grants, in most cases, from your tax dollars. So that connection there is something I would say thank you for doing. It's also part of how we help tell the story to our elected officials as to the value of these federal labs. When they see how it's not just tinkering in a lab somewhere, it isn't someone who's just trying to keep themselves busy and employed, it's actionable and actual applied science that is going out and nurturing, in this case, the aerospace industry. We're also researching fundamental technologies amongst these labs. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where we have atomic clocks, they have been working on the precision technologies guiding, they're actually under the umbrella of the Department of Commerce, guiding all sorts of technology and industry growth really since before World War I, if you go back and you see the history of the organizations where NIST came from. NIST is doing everything from getting into laser and nanotechnology that is able to measure things at a billionth of a second, and why that would matter in the real world, so to speak, gets into realms such as bioscience and even the financial world. With a globally connected economy, imagine that when a certain trade might be made at the New York Stock Exchange, and it's comparing up against other investors or other investments elsewhere around the globe, at times half a second can make a difference between how much something is worth, whether or not it's gone up or gone down. And the continued refinement and precision of timing, born of the research at NIST that is connected to all the satellites around the world, actually affects our economy in the way, or our investments in ways that most of us might not be aware of. But if you ever were trying to either sell or buy something quickly, or invest in something, and you wanted to be able to quickly find out why it was ranked at a certain amount in terms of the currency, the details that are coming from NIST and the continued refinement that they make in their precision is something that's guiding our economy in, well, it's now more important than most of us realize, especially when it comes to investments that are behind the scenes with things like your IRA, or if you have some kind of pension fund, or wherever it is that you might be investing in. They're aware of this technology, and they're always asking for even more and more precision. The technology transfer that I'm getting into, and I referenced with LASP, across all these different labs, when science comes out of the labs and creates a new industry, a new job, really comes out often with a government-funded solution, some type of technology that didn't exist before, and it was before private investors felt that there was enough of a risk reduction that they would put their own money in it. The government really is our source of first funding. The concept of having federal research labs, going back particularly after World War II, is that these are centers of seed corn for our society's economy. And the government, while often is pointed at for not making smart investments or for not being as accountable as it should be, if you dig into the technology transfer aspects of what's coming out of labs, what often happens is people are seeing the end result, or at least the midterm result of research that started in a lab. It's not that the person who now is the new startup who is out there getting or soliciting an IPO or otherwise hiring people, that they just invented it literally in their garage with no other help. Almost any company that you're looking at involved in these realms of science and technology I mentioned, aerospace, bioscience, agricultural technology, clean tech, I mentioned biotech, look for where their funding initially came from the National Science Foundation or other types of government grants, how they got started within a lab where they could fail and not be fired, or they could use equipment at scale that was well outside of their ability to ever access if they were just trying to do this with credit cards and friends chipping in. That is what we offer, the network of labs offer, as a resource and an asset to our country. So in addition to the labs, this might be a little harder to read, and I know PowerPoint never supposed to put that much language on there, but it's not the people's names as much as in the more light brown color. The network of agencies that are part of our board, they've all joined CoLabs, and many of them were there at the beginning, if not the entities, the organizations that you see on there. What they want to do is understand what those in the other realm are up to. Before I joined CoLabs, asking many of the board members, why do you participate? Why would your organization give X amount of dollars to CoLabs, given that we arrange lab tours, we do economic impact studies, we share with Congress, we have awards events. There's ways we're spotlighting the science, but why would any given company care? What's in it for them? And the common thread really comes down to we need to know what those other folks are doing. Broadly speaking, those realms I showed you earlier, the research universities, economic development organizations, and the labs themselves, and then there's private sector technology companies of all different types. They have found value in convening with or coming to events that CoLabs convenes and just learning the latest from, here's what the Colorado School of Mines is doing, here's what Colorado State University or University of Denver has as its latest grants. Or the lab folks find out, oh, this is what that technology company is doing. They didn't even realize that we're actually working on a project like that that seems to be very close to what they're already working on. Where a lot of the growth in the last few years has been is at a state level, where the Colorado State Legislature has been asking the CoLabs network to share with them what they have as potential mechanical or other types of technology solutions that would help manifest some of the policy goals that the state legislature has. So as a recent example, about a month ago now, the Colorado State Legislature passed what will be some pretty strong oil and gas development regulations that will require a different type of, a higher standard type of assessment on methane and other emissions that come from oil and gas development. That had been resisted by the industry and other political forces in Colorado, this next new high standard, for several years. But in the interest of climate change concerns and other debates about increased wildfires or droughts and impacts that come from that type of pollution, it's come now to a political forefront where there's a new standard that's been put out there for oil and gas development pollution control. You go back to 2005, and ARPA-E, which is a Department of Energy grant to the University of Colorado, led to a Nobel Prize winning laser technology discovery that's called the frequency comb laser. That was in 2005. 2 years ago, researchers at the University of Colorado and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration figured out how to use that basic technology to scan for methane, and they can now detect methane in a quantity the quarter of a human exhale from a mile away. When the Colorado State Legislature realized this a year ago, that becomes a technology that when others say, we're going to be blamed for pollution that's not ours, or there's no way to assess that at an expense that's affordable. This technology, it's not a trailer-sized piece of technology. They've gotten it down to about the size of a backpack. Now, when that technology exists, you're able to combine innovation with regulation and move forward, as Dan made a reference, move forward some societal goals, in this case around pollution reduction, that wouldn't have happened with just private sector interest. And in fact, the private sector companies that are involved in oil and gas development wouldn't have bought that technology if they weren't required to. The at least somewhat silver lining in that whole conversation with oil and gas companies is as long as my competitors have to buy or assess that pollution in the same manner, then that's maybe the best case scenario for them. Not that they're looking to have to buy another type of assessment technology, but having that assessment technology available is part of what then can move forward the political process and other types of societal goals. Now, the funding for all these labs, this is where we're starting to get into what our challenge is, and it was brought to bear in a somewhat surprisingly emotional way earlier this year when the government shut down for nearly 6 weeks. A self-imposed closing of the doors of your seed corn, as it were, research efforts across a full spectrum of industries. For a country to do that when other countries and competitors are investing at higher and higher amounts in their own industries and their own government-owned technologies is, let's say, inane and unproductive. This chart here that I'm showing you is showing that the United States is still the largest in overall expenditure in our R&D. However, China is catching up and has been catching up over the last couple of years, and other countries are also starting to increase. What's most noticeable really is not that we are the largest and have been for a long time, it's how quickly other countries are starting to catch up to us. And we have a bit of a default presumption that in our country we are the best at or otherwise have the access to medical technology, communication technology, security technology, food technology. That presumption needs to be, it's something for everyone, every taxpayer to be aware of as to what our status is contextually within the globe. Now, the trend lines that I'm mentioning, and that is global expenditures and R&D is what a GERD is. You can see over the next roughly 5 to 10 years, probably closer to 5, the expected crossing of paths between how much China in particular is investing as a country in their R&D versus the United States. They're going to eclipse us. And one way to think of the status of our industries in this country and why this might not be, why this should actually be a deep concern is if you think right now, when you get your weather information, if you're a farmer and you're getting crop information, and you're getting that right now through the U.S. Department of Agriculture combined with satellites from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, what if the technology actually was better to give you reports and that came out of Japan or came out of Germany? Would you like to get your medical technology information and standards from another country, or your communication technology? Would you like to get whatever is the 5G or something similar type of communication and connectivity technology from another country as opposed to the United States? That's the path that we're actually on, and the biggest challenge that's in our face right now. Hence the shutdown 5 months ago was galling and also deeply disturbing to numerous scientists that I was able to speak with. So it had this kind of reaction. People across government agencies felt like there is no one stepping back and looking big picture. The idea that politically we're arguing about stuff and shutting down projects that are crucial for us to keep pace was enraging, but also deeply unsettling. Imagine for your own work, if somewhat unexpectedly, or maybe you had an inkling, but it really happened. The Friday before Christmas, your computer shut down and you weren't able to access voicemail or emails or any of your data. You couldn't go into your office. You couldn't call any of your partners. You couldn't presume to do any work that was on any of your own company's property or equipment until close to Valentine's Day. And then you came back to whatever the pile of emails were and projects. And other folks had moved on. Those who didn't work for your company, they got to keep working over the last 6 weeks. They got to keep calling competitors. They got to keep their projects on track. And now you're playing both catch up as well as the loss of credibility you have with various partners who just feel like, I couldn't understand why you weren't at work back then, and that means I also can't predict that it won't happen again as well. So maybe I'll go look elsewhere for where I can get my technology, my services. And then worse, you have either yourself or some of your colleagues who end up thinking, I don't know when I might also be shut off from my projects. I should go look for work elsewhere. I can go work for someone else who, frankly, might pay me more and also will keep me employed and won't have some kind of arbitrary shutdown that affects my pay and the processes, the projects that I'm working on. So the screaming around strategic planning is some of what is what we were hearing. So let me not make it all too gloomy. There are efforts underway, and in a strategic planning realm, I often see in the government side of things the words initiative. So you can tell me afterwards when I'm here through the rest of the day what an initiative means compared to how it falls under an umbrella of planning. But one of the biggest projects that was a holdover from the Obama administration and was picked up by the Trump administration is the Return on Investment Initiative. That on your left guidebook there has just recently come out with a green paper, and they have been tasked, the National Institute of Standards and Technology has been tasked to assess and coalesce all the federal agencies across all these different departments and inform them as to what they're hearing from the private sector as to how to make all of their research more accessible and particularly more commercializable. How can they turn what is going on in federal labs, everything from the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense to the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Interior, how can they turn their research into companies, into things, into tangible products. That process right now, this came out only about a month ago, the green paper, but we are working with NIST because we're fortunate. We almost can work as a beta test for NIST. They can come to Colorado, and through the connections with collabs, we can tap into about 10 different federal agencies with this information and work on ideas and initially assess what is the technology transfer out of these agencies and how can they improve. There's a lot of getting into the weeds around IP protection, around communications, around access to both equipment and to data. And the government, as many of you may know, I worked for the government first 10 years out of school and then went to work for private sector economic development organizations. And the obvious distinction between accountability and motives between private sector folks and government, I don't know how that's ever going to be squared, and not that even necessarily one has to change over the other, but this green paper on return on investment is meant to be in that Venn diagram kind of place and get the best out of taxpayer-funded research efforts and manifest them out into the private sector. So keep an eye out for that, or if you're involved in any kind of technology that you think, well, that 800-pound gorilla version of technology that I've seen is in the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or that I know is within the U.S. Geological Survey's core research center. I just don't want to get into the molasses of federal government. I've tried it before. There's an effort underway right now to sort of skip ahead of the line, remove some of those steps, and actually make some of this technology transfer out a bit more quickly. The National Quantum Initiative is actually in reaction to particularly what's going on in China. If you really want to dig into the details of the trade war going on with China now, and often we hear the immediate impacts on farmers and the agricultural realm of our country, if you start going into it a bit more, what China has been investing in and how they've been ramping up through both, let's say, overt and covert means in quantum computing technology and other types of quantum physics technology. This is a huge threat to our ability to maintain our leadership status across a whole realm of next generation technologies around bioscience, around communications, around military assets, and around aerospace. So the National Quantum Initiative was signed by President Trump back in December, and it was a bipartisan bill, and it will create 5 to 7 national quantum centers of excellence around the country at the GILA Joint Research Institute up at CU Boulder campus. That's one of the entities that's in the running to become one of these centers for excellence. And that is a topic in particular that I don't see as much in the news, but if you're wondering why we might want to manage as effectively as possible some kind of trade war with China, the motives behind it and how it's being handled are, well, they're a great conversation and thought exercise to get into. Talk about strategic planning. That actually needs to happen there. The folks from the labs would have great ideas, as well as economic development and other technology folks, but the political realm comes in and really just becomes a different kind of conversation. I think your insight into strategic planning in the political realm would be, you'd probably either be maddened or you might be totally inspired to get in there. I've found that this messy, inefficient often, and complex crossover between private sector companies that actually manifests goals and the government sector and the public sector that actually sets those goals, that's hard, but that's where you want to be. That's where it's not easy, but it's where progress is made in terms of the evolution of society. Joe Neguse is the representative from Congressional District 2 here in Colorado, and a couple weeks ago he and a Republican, he's a Democrat, and a Republican representative from Texas created an innovation caucus, and their entire purpose is to reach out to federal agencies and help figure out how they can make better connections with the private sector, similar to the green paper that I mentioned from NIST. And that kind of political, at least first raising their hand effort is not common, and it also needs a lot of help. There's the political realm where they can say this is what we want to do, but they're busy with a whole soup to nuts list of stuff and various hot buttons and fires that pop up on their day. So if you're interested in strategic planning around how innovation in the United States can move forward. Know that this caucus has just been created, and it could be the case that back in your state there's a representative who is part of that caucus and would be very interested in your advice or insights or complaints. The green paper actually starts off with a whole bunch of complaints, but then here's what we're hearing and here's how we're going to move forward. So look to engage in that political realm. It might be a way that is a civic duty, or at least of civic interest to you, and we collectively, the country, need smart people's help getting into those conversations with our congressmen. These challenges do remain, notwithstanding those progress points that I was just describing. The last couple of years, the budgets that have been put forward by the Trump administration have had severe cuts proposed across a wide range of scientific research labs or the scientific research aspects of different federal agencies. In particular, the ARPA-E grants, which are focused on high-risk, high-reward, pre-investor renewable energy technologies, that has been particularly singled out for 100% elimination by the Trump administration. Now, as it happens over the last couple of years, the funding for scientific research writ large in our government, in our federal budget, has actually gone up. There's been this interesting political dynamic of the administration putting out a somewhat harsh, or that might be the right word, but otherwise a budget with some severe cuts across many different federal agencies, and Congress has just balled that up and thrown it over their shoulder and said, we're living on credit cards, and they've risen the amount that has been approved. So in the long run, as a taxpayer, that might not seem sustainable. If any of you followed discussions around our debt or deficit, the idea of raising the budget and not necessarily taking in as much, that's a somewhat on its face complicated or questionable policy decision. But knowing that that's the context, part of really the reason I got involved in collabs was I like to go to these labs and say, what are you doing with taxpayer dollars? You have to be able to describe why giving you money to work on this actually matters to people who don't care about that technology or who have never heard of your technology. And certainly if they start to find out about it, you're going to have a good story as to why you do it better or are part of a chain of commercialization leading to solutions for society that no one else could do better. And when I say no one, I mean another entity couldn't do it better than you in the private sector. Scientists, for the most part, are not that interested in speaking publicly to Congress or to getting up in front of a room of folks like yourself and defending what they work on. But Collabs does this as a main part of our mission to make sure that the decision makers writing checks to federal agencies are able to see here's the connection between taxpayer input, discovery, and manifestation of products that you're using every day. So back to the beginning when I mentioned Keynote, GPS and the fabrics, and we have food and water, etc. Those are all sourced from your taxpayer dollars. And so I'm going to prompt you all to connect these dots here. When scientists are working and making sure that our water is clean, our food is safe, our air is cleaner, our transportation system works, the internet works when you turn it on, the communication systems you use are available. All that foundation being taken care of means you get to go out and not worry about where you're eating today or whether the water you drink is going to make you sick the rest of the afternoon. You get to go be with your clients and manifest their goals and their vision. And in that way, strategic planners, people in your role, I see you get to build on if the society as today, the status quo today, is born of scientific research that you're paying for as a taxpayer. They're taking care of making society function. You get to stand on that and help develop Society 3.0. That is actually their sort of convoluted orange-black logo in there. But check out Society 3.0 and perceive yourself as being in that spot. Scientists are taking care of the basics. My phone works, the internet is working, the lights come on, the water is safe, the food is safe, and other technologies are coming my way to make my work even more efficient. That means you can go out and be brilliant with your clients and make sure that they're working on what they need to, because all this is happening in the background. And with that, I want to say thank you for listening to me about Colorado's ecosystem. Oh, okay.
We have plenty.
You do? Okay.
Thanks, Dan. great preview of how things are connected. So we have a few minutes. We can take a few questions and get some responses from Dan. I don't know if we have any other microphones out in the area here. Jim?
Thanks, Dan. I'll start it off. Dan, wonderful presentation. One of your slides referred to the future of work, but you didn't really talk about it. And I was wondering, with the advance in AI, machine learning, and robots, what kinds of things are your consortium working on the robot-human work? Because some of our strategic planners are trying to figure that out. What does it mean for our jobs? Does it mean for who's going to be doing what? Are we actually going to have jobs? What kind of work can you say Collabs is doing?
Well, you know what, I'm connected in. So advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence and robotics. Think of them coming together. It's a bigger Venn diagram with those three entities. And anyone who is doing manual labor may have to be concerned about robotics replacing what they do. But what we're finding in in artificial intelligence as a key issue is that as machines are getting smarter, or predictive capabilities are getting smarter and smarter, born of big data, so all of our phones that we're carrying around with us and all the apps that we're using are absorbing like massive sponges into a Borg-like form of knowledge. But it's data that cannot be crunched by a machine as people are learning in the same way as it can by a human. What you offer and what anyone in a given industry, especially if it's more in manufacturing, has to take into account and perceive upon themselves is, how do I assess this information and then know what to do with it? The computer technology can code out and be able to have some type of process that says, if this comes in, then it needs to go this way. If that comes in, it needs to go that way. Where humans have the capacity, and will always have to be learning, though this might be the inconvenient truth, is that as much as you're able to assess the context and the scope of information in your industry, and then be able to say, here's how my experience, my knowledge, and my ability, my intuition in many ways, connects the dots, and hence it means this. Intuition isn't something that machines will ever have, or at least not in the same way as humans. So if people are concerned about what their clients are seeing in robotics coming into their industry, I would say they need to recognize the robotics as, in some ways, an inevitable or at least evolving new paradigm for performing a function, and it will be our brains and our creativity that give us the next leg up on, well, here's what I'm seeing happening, and here's why what that robot's doing could maybe be done in a different way. That is somewhat unsettling if you don't feel that you're a creative person, or you haven't gone back for some type of certificate or updated training recently. Plan to. Read. And I don't mean to be glib, but the constant learning. My 9 and 11-year-old daughters, they are not, since they're not teenagers yet, they're not already saying, well, everything I'm learning doesn't matter, and this is just a waste of time. But to tell them, you're learning how to learn. You will always be learning. Just enjoy learning. That is something I hope is a mindset that the younger kids can grow up with, and they will be going back for some other type of 2-year certificate program or other training when they're 35, because they'll have to. The evolution of technology, and also the population around the globe that in a macroeconomic sense will be able to do certain chores, certain processes, certain jobs at a lower cost, just because labor costs less in other parts of the world, and then other technologies allow whatever that product is to be brought to us easily. You'll just have to know you're going to need to learn every 5 to 10 years an additional skill. And that's hopefully not daunting. Hopefully that's just exciting. It's a better way to live.
Any other questions? We have time for a couple. Here, let me.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Raphael Jones. I work for the Office of Personnel Management in DC. And you probably can't answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You kind of spoke about narrow AI when you describe, tasks that some algorithm would actually accomplish for people. So that's more narrow AI, if I'm not mistaken, where it does a task. General AI is a little bit more complex and critically. Well, I'm reluctant to use the word critical thinking, but it's more geared towards complex thinking, not like we think certainly, but more complex thinking. Now, having said that, certain I've been reading a lot lately about certain AI that is opaque. Can you speak to how maybe we can address that, since you talk to government agencies, or you work with scientists to bridge that gap? How might a government agency begin to address the opacity issue that AI brings, if that makes any sense?
Yes, and so when you say opaque, meaning someone
We
someone
don't, we
knows
don't,
what's in the black box, but
right, exactly. We don't know how it came to whatever decision it made.
Uh, and interesting. The first thing that comes to mind is that still happens today without even any technology. It's what just happened in that back room over there, and uh, even the pop culture reference to Hamilton, since my daughters listen to that all the time, is I want to be in the room where it happened. That question comes up from anyone who doesn't feel like they were part of a decision process or otherwise empowered to be assessing all of the same information that some other given decision makers have. And in government, that's a particular challenge, because the hierarchy and the expectation of where you are in a given relationship with within the structure of an organization is somewhat hardwired. And if you want to be moving up, you need to do the correct thing and stay in your lane right now. And after you're there for enough time, or you achieve some certain benchmark, then you get to bump up. And within the government's agencies, boy, this is a tough. I'm thinking of some of the scientists who are working on AI in the quantum realm. The joint institutes. So here's maybe where there's some hope, or where there's just a whole different type of paradigm. Joint institutes on research campuses, research university campuses between federal agencies and the universities. The flexibility, the protocols are so less involved, and the private sector finds that that's where they go. One, because they can do things, they can iterate much faster, but secondly, they're working with often free labor with grad students, and then they're able to hire the best of them, come in and scrape the cream off the top of that crop of students. So those scientists, because they're more in an academic realm as opposed to a federal government role, they want to share what they're doing. If anything, they know that people knowing what we're doing is how I'll remain funded, or at least I'm doing this because I'm truly a scientist and curious. I want to know how, and I like to say wow. And when those two things come together, I want to share that with folks. So it may be that joint institutes on campuses within whatever more particular industry or realm of science that you're talking about, where those exist, go there first. I think the flexibility and in many ways the mindset of the people who are there to share what they're doing would be just a bit more open.
Thanks very much, Dan. I think we've got time for a short break before our other sessions start at 9:45. I just want to thank you for coming
Dan.
and telling the story.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
So sessions will begin in the breakout rooms over here, the 3 crystal rooms, in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. I like that. There was a lot of info. Oh.